Hello and welcome to the Frailty module of the ENNEADI project. This is the first of two presentations in which I will provide definition, the natural history and the epidemiology of this syndrome. As we know, the Western world is aging, and as a consequence of aging, some people become frail. In order to understand the Frailty syndrome, the presentation is divided in three parts. So, in the first part, we'll define the Frailty syndrome. In the second part, we will see what is the natural history of this syndrome. And finally, we'll take a look at the epidemiology of the Frailty syndrome. So, the Frailty syndrome can be defined as a clinically recognizable state of increased vulnerability due to the decline in physiological function and reserve across multiple physiological systems, which is characteristically age-associated, but as we will see later on, this is not entirely true. Which leads to an impairment of the ability to cope with stressors, which can be everyday stressors or acute stressors, like, for instance, admission to hospital for an acute illness. The Frailty syndrome can be operationally defined by the so-called Frailty phenotype, which is 5-item questionnaire, which includes these 5 concepts. As you can see, I've provided the corresponding ICF categories. So before 55, exhaustion, poor endurance, which is usually self-reported by patients. B530, malnutrition, weight loss. There must be at least 5 kilograms of unintentional weight loss in the prior year. B730, weakness, which is measured by reduction of 20% of grip strength. D450, slowness, measured by the 10 meters walking time, 20% slowest than the expected values by sex and height. And finally, D920, low level of physical activity, which means a burning of at least 383 kilocalories per week for males and 270 kilocalories per week for females. When there are none of these criteria, basically there are no elements of the Frailty syndrome. When there are just 1 or 2 criteria, we define this state as pre-frailty, whereas when there are at least 3 criteria or more, this is the full-blown Frailty syndrome. Frailty is a different concept from comorbidity as well as disability. In this study from Chen et al., on a sample of 2,762 elderly patients, basically 2,131 had comorbidity, which is the 77%. 2% had at least disability as defined as a activity limitation in at least 1 or more activities of daily living, whereas just 4% had a full-blown Frailty syndrome without disability and comorbidity. But if we look at the intersection, then we can see that 6% of patients had an association between frailty and comorbidity. 1% had an association between frailty and disability, and 7% had at least one satisfied the criteria for disability and comorbidity. About 3%, 79 individuals, had both add together frailty, disability, and comorbidity. So if we take a look at the prevalence of frailty alone or associated with disability and or comorbidity, it makes around 13.3%, which means basically 368 individuals. Actually, there is a relationship between aging, frailty, and disability. If we represent the functional state in percentage in over the years, we talk about healthy aging when there is progressive but slow reduction of the functional state, so that the person enters the frailty stage at a very, very late age. On the other hand, other individuals do have a sort of accelerated aging, which leads to a rapid decline of the functional state, which leads in turn to frailty, and in turn again to frailty. If the process is not halted and reversed, then the progression towards disability and ultimately death is unfortunately not reversible any longer. Thus, frailty is an health condition which is separated from disability, comorbidity, although these health conditions may coexist. In some way, health, frailty, and disability do share the same continuum. So, as we saw with biopsychosocial model, we start from a condition of normal functioning, full functioning, leading to disability through two intermediate stages, which are pre-frailty and then frailty. Now let's have a look at the natural history of the Frailty Syndrome. So, the Frailty Syndrome is a well-defined clinical syndrome captured by the frailty phenotype. In some way, the 5 frailty phenotype items show between them some association. Therefore, in some way, the FP provides a theoretical framework to demonstrate the hierarchical progression of frailty. This is an infograph showing the vicious circle of frailty, which basically is a self-perpetuating cycle made of naturally progressing events. Let's suppose that, for instance, first of all, there is a reduction in strength. This can lead to reduction on walking speed, which can lead to reduced activity. This can lead to total reduction of the total energy expenditure, leading to weight loss by the means of chronic undernutrition, so inadequate intake of protein and energy, micronutrient deficiency, and so on and so forth. The weight loss leads to sarcopenia. Sarcopenia in turn makes weakness even more relevant, but also it reduces the VO2 max, leading to exhaustion. And also sarcopenia reduces resting metabolic rate. So further reduction in strength can lead to impaired balance, falls, and injuries, leading to immobilization. Reduction of VO2 max and exhaustion can lead to reduced walking speed. As a consequence, immobilization, reduced walking speed can lead to disability and dependency. Disability and reduced walking speed can lead to further decrease of activity, which can in turn, lead to reduced total energy expenditure together with resting metabolic rate. It's a vicious circle because there is no way to escape unless there are a specific intervention on any of these elements of the Frailty syndrome. So the important thing is that we have to bear in mind that the Frailty syndrome can start from any of these 5 elements. However, differential initial manifestation may lead to different progression rates, as we will see in a few minutes. So the frailty phenotype distinguishes the Frailty syndrome from comorbidity and disability, which we have seen are separate although allied concepts. And furthermore, it's quite easy to use because they're just it is made just of 5 items. In this study, the Women's Health and Aging Study, which was a longitudinal prospective study, 420 non-frail elderly women were enrolled and longitudinally observed over years. And this study actually demonstrated that frailty can start at any point in the cycle. The most common first manifestation is weakness, which is related to sarcopenia. Weakness, slowness, and low physical activity is the initial triad of frailty in 76% of non-frail elderly women. So weakness is usually the first element of the pre-frail state, whereas weakness, reduced walking speed, and low levels of physical activity is in 76% of the cases the initial presentation triad of frailty. Also, the study demonstrated that when the presenting symptom is exhaustion or weight loss, the risk of progression to frailty is 80%. So the hazard ratio for frailty development is 3.0. Whereas when the presenting symptom is weakness, the hazard ratio is just 2.6. However, weakness may be an early indicator of vulnerability risk. So this is exactly what we showed before. When weight loss and or exhaustion are the presenting symptoms, the risk of progression to full frailty syndrome is very, very high. So let's have a look now at the epidemiology of the Frailty syndrome. The prevalence in the USA of the pre-frailty syndrome is 28 to 44%, whereas the prevalence of the frailty syndrome is 4 to 16%. So this means that likely not all pre-frail persons evolve to develop a full-blown frailty syndrome. Prevalence increases with age as expected. So in those who are 95 years old or more, the prevalence of frailty syndrome is about 40%. In those who are above 85 years is around 25%, whereas in those who are above 65 is just 4%. There is a gender prevalence for the frailty syndrome, which strikes 5% of men and 8% of women. So the female gender is more prevalent. And also there is a racial influence. The frailty syndrome is highly prevalent between the African American with 13%, whereas it strikes only 6% of Caucasians. What about the rest of the world? Well, in Europe, the prevalence is around 17% with important regional variation in sense of north-south increasing gradient. So, for instance, it's just 6% in Switzerland whereas it's 27% in Spain. In Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, total prevalence is much higher. Again, there is gender prevalence, so it strikes from 30 to 48% of women and from 21 to 35% of men. The epidemiological study shows that there are different rates of progression on the basis of the presenting syndrome. In some way, the course may be slowly progressive or sudden and acute, and in this case, quite usually, there is a precipitating illness accelerating the progression of the Frailty syndrome. Considering sample of 754 individuals, which were followed up across 18 months, 68% of individuals showed at least one transition, which may means going from healthy aging, 0 criteria, to the Frailty syndrome. 22% showed 2 transitions, so at least two criteria. 9% showed at least 3 transitions. The good news is that about 1/3 of individuals within the sample were able to some way decrease their degree of frailty, going back from a greater degree of frailty to a lesser degree of frailty. The mortality risk is high. The hazard ratio for women is 1.71, whereas it's much higher for men, is 2.05. So in some way, the gender prevalence is reversed as far as the mortality risk is concerned. So basically in this presentation we have seen the definition, the natural history and the epidemiology of the Frailty syndrome. The take-home message are: the Frailty syndrome is a clinical recognizable state of increased vulnerability due to the decline in physiological function and reserve, which is characteristically age-associated and leading to the impairment of the ability to cope with stressors. The frailty phenotype describes perfectly the Frailty syndrome, which consists of 5 domains which can be categorized using the ICF. So B455 exhaustion, B530 malnutrition, B730 weakness, D450 slowness, D920 low levels of physical activity. The first 2 items, exhaustion and malnutrition, are usually associated with a greater risk to progress to full-blown Frailty syndrome. And finally, we have to remember that frailty is a different health construct from disability and comorbidity, although these health conditions may coexist in a single individual. Thank you very much.